Police knocked on my door at 11:30 in the morning, and the first thing I felt was relief, not fear. Relief, the specific kind that comes when you've been waiting for something to arrive, and it finally does, and at least now you can stop waiting. By 11:30, I'd been awake for over 6 hours. I'd been inside for 6 hours, which is a thing that happens differently when you're doing it by choice, and differently again when you're doing it because your neighbor knocked on your door before sunrise and grabbed your arm, and you've been sitting in your own apartment since then trying to decide what's real. I'd watched through my front window as the day outside did its ordinary Tuesday things: a mail carrier moving down the opposite side of the street, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck pulling away from the building next door. All of it looking exactly like nothing. All of it feeling like something could be in it that I couldn't see. That's what a morning like this does. It makes the ordinary landscape into a problem of interpretation. Every figure at a distance, something you scan and assess, and then tell yourself to stop scanning, then scan again. I'd made 3 cups of coffee and drunk one of them. I'd called my office and said I was sick, and the administrative assistant had said feel better, and I'd said thank you in a voice that was mostly performing normalcy. I'd started 2 texts to my sister and deleted both of them, not because I didn't want to tell her, but because I didn't know yet what I was telling, whether the photograph was what I thought it was, or whether I'd spent a day off work based on my neighbor's blurry parking lot snap of a man I may have misidentified. I'd gone back to the kitchen table 4 times to look at the photograph again. Every time it said the same thing. At some point around 10 in the morning, I'd knocked on my ceiling with the handle of my broom, the signal Marcus and I had invented that morning over coffee, and he'd come downstairs and sat with me while I walked him through what I'd found, and he'd read the court filing on my laptop screen, and looked up at me, and said you should call, and I'd said I know, and we'd sat there another few minutes while I got there. When the officers knocked, I was ready for them, sitting in the chair nearest the door with my phone in my hand and the photograph queued up to show them. I opened the door before the second knock. "Miss Vance," the shorter one said, "we have some questions about a man named Gerald Pruitt." Gerald Pruitt was my ex-boyfriend's father. He was 61 years old, retired, and he had spent the last 8 months building a list. Let me back you into the part of this story I keep coming back to, because the police at the door is not the part. Before I do, subscribe if stories about what happens when ordinary private people find themselves on someone else's list interest you. Stay with me, because by the end of this you'll know exactly what that feels like from the inside, and you'll understand why I still check my name in certain places at certain hours even now. Subscribe and I'll take you through the whole thing. My name is Sasha Vance, 32 years old, a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Phoenix, Arizona, living alone in a ground-floor apartment in a complex I'd chosen for the parking and the price and hadn't thought about much since. Marcus lived upstairs. We'd been neighborly in the practical sense. Packages, parking spots, the occasional hallway conversation. For 14 months. He was 29, worked nights as a line cook, came home at hours that would alarm a normal person, and didn't alarm me because I knew his schedule. He was the kind of neighbor you don't think about and then realize, when something happens, you've been quietly grateful for the whole time. I want to tell you about Gerald Pruitt before I tell you about his list. Because understanding the list requires understanding the man, and understanding the man requires a little bit of understanding what it's like to spend 2 years in a family that doesn't want you in it. Ryan was 34 when I met him, a structural engineer, quiet and careful in the way that good engineers often are, with the particular neatness of someone who thinks in tolerances and load calculations and things that either hold or don't. We were good together for about 18 months, and less good for the 6 months after that, and we ended the way things end when 2 people are too reasonable to fight about it, by acknowledging together that they'd grown into different directions and should separate before they couldn't anymore. I don't say any of this to idealize us. The relationship had its problems, and we both contributed to them, but it ended cleanly, and I thought it was finished, and I was wrong about that in a way I hadn't anticipated. Gerald Pruitt, Ryan's father, had never warmed to me. I want to be precise about what that looked like, because it was never loud, never directly hostile, nothing you could point at in a room and say, that man is behaving badly. It was the absence of warmth, sustained and consistent, the slight redirect of conversation whenever I contributed to it, the way he'd address a question to Ryan that I'd just answered, the invisible parentheses he put around my presence at every family table. His wife compensated. Ryan's mother was kind to me in the deliberate way of a woman who is aware her husband isn't being kind and has decided to cover the gap, and I'd spent 2 years navigating the gap gracefully, I thought. And then the relationship ended, and I assumed Gerald Pruitt closed with it like a chapter. Ryan and I ended things about 9 months before that Tuesday. I figured Gerald Pruitt became a closed chapter. I figured wrong. Marcus had gone out Monday night, which was unusual for him. He rarely went anywhere on days he was working the next morning, but a friend was in town, and he'd made an exception. He'd ended up at a bar in Tempe he didn't know well, staying later than he'd meant to. The way you do when someone you haven't seen in years is sitting across from you, and the time keeps moving, and you keep telling yourself one more. Around 2 in the morning, he'd gone to the parking lot to get some air and check his phone, and he'd seen a man sitting in an older silver sedan that was parked 2 spots from his car, not doing anything alarming in an obvious way, just sitting. But the hour and the stillness had made Marcus pay attention in the way he paid attention to things in parking lots at 2 in the morning, which was carefully, because working nights in kitchens for 5 years teaches you to read the late-night atmosphere of a place, who belongs in it and who's sitting in it wrong. 60 or so, clean-cut, unremarkable except for the legal pad on the steering wheel and the phone mounted on his dash with a bright screen in the dark of the car. Not scrolling, not talking, just lit, displaying something the man was consulting while he wrote. Marcus had gotten close enough on his natural path to his own car to see that the phone screen was showing a social media profile, a woman's. He'd been close enough to see the name on the profile header, mine. He'd recognized it because of the parking lot encounter we'd had 2 weeks earlier, when I'd introduced myself after he'd helped me rescue my grocery bags from a runaway cart. He'd seen my name on the card reader screen when I tapped to pay, glanced at my face, registered both, because Marcus, as I would come to understand, registers things, and now here was that same name on a stranger's phone in a bar parking lot at 2 in the morning while the stranger wrote on a legal pad. He'd taken a photograph before he let himself think too hard about whether to. Just raised his phone as he walked past, angled it toward the windshield, snapped it. The way you take a photograph of something you know you'll want later. Then he'd gotten to his car and sat in it for a long time before he drove home, and he'd spent 2 more hours in his apartment going back and forth on what the photograph was worth. Whether he'd misread the name, whether there was an explanation he wasn't seeing, until at 5:01 in the morning he decided that if he was wrong he could handle the embarrassment, but if he was right he couldn't handle the alternative. At 5:01 he came downstairs and knocked on my door. I want to tell you about the moment he grabbed my arm, because it's the moment everything reorganized itself and I need to give it its full weight. I'd opened the door on the chain, seen Marcus, heard his first sentence, "Don't go outside today, not even once," and I'd laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not dismissive on purpose, just the exhausted reflex laugh you produce when something lands wrong before you've had coffee. I told him I had work in 2 hours and he should go to sleep. I was already pushing the door closed, chain catching, "Good morning," and then his hand came through the gap and wrapped around my forearm, gentle but not movable, the grip of a man who needed exactly 4 more seconds of my attention. "I saw your name last night," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of someone who has been awake for 3 hours rehearsing how to say something and is now finally in the moment of saying it. "Your name and your face on a man's phone screen in a parking lot at 2 in the morning. And the man had a legal pad in his lap with what looked like a list, and I took a photograph. I need you to look at the photograph before you make any decisions about where you're going today." He wasn't breathless. He wasn't frantic. He was the opposite, the kind of still that people get when they've already done the panicking and come out the other side into a cold determination to say the thing that needs saying. And that stillness was what got me, more than the words. Marcus, who I'd seen cheerful and half asleep in the hallway, who kept odd hours and cooked for restaurants and was easygoing about everything, was not easygoing right now. He was the way a person is when they've decided the easy thing is not the available thing anymore. I unchained the door and let him in. His phone was already unlocked to the photograph, queued up the way you queue something up when you've looked at it many times and want someone else to see it without any preamble. He handed it to me and stepped back a little, giving me space to look, which told me something about him. He wasn't hovering, wasn't managing my reaction, just giving me the information and letting me land on it. I stood in my hallway at 5 in the morning and looked at it. I'm perfect. The angle was low and slightly blurred, bar parking lot light doing its dim orange best, but clear enough. At the top of the legal pad page, in neat, cramped handwriting, was what appeared to be a column of names with addresses next to them. My name was third from the top, Sasha Vance, and then my address, and then what appeared to be a schedule, days of the week with times next to them. A schedule. He had written out my schedule. Gym on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6:30 a.m. I could see that much. Work at 8:15 most days. Home between 6 and 6:30. All of it accurate. All of it the kind of information that requires presence. Repeated presence. Over time, in the places where I go. I went cold in a way that moved from my chest outward and took about 4 seconds to reach my extremities. Not theatrical, not the cold of a movie, just a real physical thing. The body understanding something before the brain finishes processing it. That someone had been watching me with enough regularity to produce a schedule accurate enough to be worth writing down. Watching me at the gym in the early morning. Watching me at the office. Following a pattern of my days that I myself couldn't have recited without looking at my calendar. And here it was in someone else's handwriting. Organized, deliberate, a document of me seen from outside my own life. And I knew whose handwriting it was. Not because I'd studied it or been told, because I'd seen it, casually, in the ordinary drift of 2 years in a family, birthday cards and grocery lists and a check signed at Christmas. Neat, small, each letter slightly compressed, formed, with the consistency of someone who'd been writing the same way for 40 years. Gerald Pruitt's handwriting. I stood in the hallway and said nothing for a long moment. Marcus waited. He'd been waiting since 2 a.m. in various configurations, and he had apparently gotten very good at it. I looked at the photograph, and I thought about 8 months of ordinary life since Ryan and I had ended. 8 months of going to the gym and going to work and coming home. 8 months I had experienced as unobserved, and I thought about how wrong that was. "Come inside," I said. He came inside. I locked the door. We sat at my kitchen table in the 5 in the morning dark, both phones on the table between us, and I thought about what I knew and what I could find and what I needed to do with it. Here's the part one want to be honest about, because it's the part that's hardest to admit, and also the most important. My first instinct, sitting at that table, was to explain it away. To find a reading of the photograph that didn't require me to believe that a retired 61-year-old man with a nice house in Scottsdale had been sitting in bar parking lots at 2 in the morning writing my schedule on a legal pad. People keep lists. Lawyers keep lists. Private investigators keep lists. Maybe he was doing something entirely unrelated, and I'd recognized the handwriting wrong in a blurry bar lot photograph, and my name on that page was someone else's name that just looked like mine, and the whole thing was my fear pattern matching on an ambiguous image. That's what a reasonable person does when faced with evidence that frightens her. She finds the unreasonable explanation that requires less fear. I'm a paralegal. 8 years of my career has been spent watching people do exactly this. In depositions, on witness stands, in police reports, the retroactive search for the benign interpretation, the thing you want to believe inserted gently between you and the thing that's actually true. I know the move. I made it anyway. At 5 in the morning, because knowing a move intellectually and not making it when your name is on a list in a stranger's car are two entirely different things. Marcus looked at me while I was doing this. While I was explaining to him the various reasons it was probably fine, he sat across my kitchen table and looked at me with the patience of a man who'd already done this argument with himself and lost it. And eventually he said, "Sasha, just my name. Just the one word. The way you say someone's name when what you mean is, stop." I stopped. I called my office. I said I was sick. Then I sat at the table for another hour after Marcus went upstairs, watching the windows get light, and I thought about what I knew and what I could find out and what was the difference between being cautious and being paranoid. And I decided that in this particular case, the cost of paranoia was staying home for 1 day, and the cost of being cautious but wrong was a thing I didn't want to name. At 8 in the morning, I opened my laptop and started looking. Not because I'd decided what I was looking for. I hadn't yet named the theory I already half had, but because looking is what I do when I don't know what else to do, and because 8 years of working for attorneys has made me believe, more than most people believe it, that information is almost always better than the absence of it, even when the information is frightening. Especially then. 2 hours of paralegal trained research on Gerald Pruitt. Not the same as a professional investigation, but not nothing either. I know where public records live. I know which county databases are searchable. I know how to read a court filing and what an asset search looks like, and how to find address histories. I pulled his property records, his business filings, his social media going back 2 years, a court filing from 18 months earlier that I'd never known about, and that stopped me cold when I found it. A civil case, a former business partner dispute, dismissed but ugly. References in the filing to what the plaintiff's lawyer had called a pattern of targeted blame. Targeted blame. 2 words from a court document that I read 4 times at my kitchen table while Marcus slept upstairs, and the day outside went about its Tuesday business without any idea what was happening in my apartment. Then I found the former colleagues. On a professional, networking platform, 2 former coworkers of Gerald's from the company that had folded. And when I looked at their mutual connections and cross-referenced with a few other things that an attorney I know once showed me how to find, I found something that the police, when they came, confirmed I'd found correctly, that 2 of the other names I could partially make out in the photograph, one clearly visible, one I'd guessed at, had each recently reported to police a man matching Gerald Pruitt's description, making unusual inquiries about their schedules, their addresses, their whereabouts. One of them had filed a formal report. One had simply called and said something feels wrong, and then called back when nothing happened. Marcus came back down at 10 when I knocked on my ceiling with a broom handle, the signal we'd invented that morning. I showed him what I'd found. He read through it at the kitchen table with his coffee, slowly, and when he finished he looked up and said, "You call, or you want me to?" I called. Gerald Pruitt had lost his job 14 months earlier. Not fired, the company had folded, a small manufacturing business he'd worked at for 22 years, and at 60 he'd found the job market for his specific skills to be approximately what it is for 60-year-olds, which is to say largely closed. He'd had retirement savings that the company's pension collapse had reduced by most of their value. He'd spent the last year applying for jobs and not getting them and watching his finances move in one direction, and somewhere in that year he had developed a particular way of thinking about it that I recognized, with a sick clarity, from the kinds of cases my firm handled. He blamed people, specific people. Not the market, not the timing, not the particular brutal math of industrial decline in the American Southwest. People. A list of people, it turned out. Not a hitman's list, not an arsonist's list. Though the discovery of a list in that context produces exactly the same fear, and the fear is not irrational, because people with lists like this sometimes become people who act on lists like this, and the line between obsessive grievance and real harm is not always visible from the outside. His list included his former boss, his former business partner, 2 people from the company's board, a woman he'd lent money to who hadn't paid it back, and me. I need to sit in that for a second, because when the police confirmed it, later I had to. Because in Gerald's private accounting of everything that had gone wrong, my presence in his son's life during the years when Ryan might otherwise have been building the kind of financial stability that would let him help his parents, had been, in the invisible logic of obsessive grief, a thread that connected, however irrationally, to the general unraveling of things. Ryan had spent money on our relationship, time on our relationship, had perhaps delayed certain choices because of our relationship, and in Gerald's ledger this connected to everything. A woman who'd been a distraction, an interference, a reason his son hadn't done the things a son might have done if he'd been different in those years. I'm not going to pretend any of that makes sense. It doesn't. Not from outside the closed room where it was assembled, but from inside a room built from a year of loss and a lifetime of a certain kind of pride. It apparently had an internal logic. Gerald Pruitt had lost a career, a pension, 2 decades of savings, and his sense of himself as a man whose work had meant something, and grief of that kind needs somewhere to go, and the place it goes, in certain temperaments, is into a ledger, a careful private accounting where every loss has a cause, and every cause has a face. I'd been one of the faces, not the first or the last, third from the top, which means there were 2 people Gerald had decided were more responsible for his losses than I was, and I've thought about those 2 people, their Tuesday mornings, whether they're okay. What I know about obsessive grievance, from 8 years of paralegal work, is that it almost always looks manageable from the outside right up until the moment it doesn't. A man keeping notes in a parking lot is not obviously the same as a man who becomes dangerous. Sometimes the note-keeping is the whole thing, a private theater, and it never goes further. Sometimes it's a first act. Nobody in the system can tell you which, and that uncertainty is something you eventually have to make your peace with, because the alternative is sitting inside every possibility at once, and that is not a livable place. He'd been watching me the way he'd been watching the others on his list, with a retired man's time and a grieving man's focus, and no clear plan beyond the list itself, which is the most frightening combination, because a clear plan is at least legible. What he had was a legal pad, and a schedule, and a series of parking lots at late hours. Whether it would have stayed that way, I can't know. The police, when they came, couldn't tell me either, which is the answer that stays with you longest. Not the crimes people commit, but the ones that remain permanently hypothetical because someone looked up from a parking lot in time. I gave them the photograph. I gave them my statement, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd been sitting since before sunrise, with the same cold coffee from 3 cups earlier, and Marcus in the chair to my left, present and quiet in the way he'd been present and quiet all morning, offering nothing that wasn't asked for, and never once reminding me that he'd been awake since 2 in the morning on my behalf. I told the officers everything I'd found in 2 hours of searching, which they already knew most of, and were professionally gracious about me knowing. One of them, the taller one, with the careful eyes, looked at my laptop screen where I'd left the court filing open and said, "You've been busy this morning," and I said yes, and he nodded in the way of a person who has encountered paralegals before, and is neither surprised nor displeased. What they could tell me was that 2 of the other people on the list had already filed reports in the past 6 weeks. Gerald had been interviewed once and denied threatening intent, had characterized his list as personal processing, a way of managing his feelings about his losses, not a plan or a threat, which was possibly true and also possibly exactly what a man who kept his notes in a bar parking lot at 2 in the morning would say if interviewed. A case file existed but lacked something that made it actionable. Marcus's photograph, they told me, was that something, a specific documented instance of surveillance of a specific named individual in a public place, combined with an existing pattern report and a prior interview, added up to a file that now had enough in it to move. They thanked Marcus when they left. He nodded and said he was glad he stopped. The shorter officer paused in the doorway and said, "You made the right call coming to your neighbor." And Marcus said, "I know," simply, without false modesty and without performing it, just a man who had run the calculation and gotten the right answer, and was glad about it. I stood in the doorway after they left and watched their car pull out of the lot, and then I went back to the kitchen and sat down. And for a few minutes, neither Marcus nor I said anything. Outside the windows, the day was fully arrived by then, noon bright, normal, a Tuesday in Phoenix in September that had no idea what had happened in the apartment facing it. That contrast always gets me when I think back on it. The absolute ordinariness of 11:45 a.m. on a Tuesday, people going to lunch, a dog across the courtyard barking at something, the mail arriving, and inside this kitchen, 2 people sitting with the weight of a morning that had reorganized something. Marcus ate the cereal he'd brought down from his apartment. I finally drank a cup of coffee that was actually hot. At some point he said, "You okay?" And I said yes, which was approximately true. Not okay in the sense of fine, but okay in the sense of still here, still in one piece, in possession of my Tuesday, which was more than the morning had promised. He nodded and didn't ask anything else, because that was his nature, and I was beginning to understand that his nature was something worth knowing about. Gerald Pruitt did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that, because these stories often wrap into a courtroom bow, and this one didn't. What happened was a restraining order, a formal warning, a requirement to attend certain counseling, and the ongoing slow machinery of a system that exists to manage dangerous grievance rather than simply stop it, because simple stopping is rarer than the movies suggest. He cooperated when confronted with the photograph, not immediately, not without some of the defensiveness you'd expect from a man who has built an internal story about his own reasonableness, but eventually, because the file was now substantial enough to make cooperation the more sensible choice, and Gerald Pruitt was, at bottom, a man who understood sensible choices. He moved to another state a few months later. His son Ryan called me once to apologize, a phone call I hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to receive, and I told him I was okay, and I meant it, and I've thought about that call a few times since, about what it costs to pick up the phone for something like that, about what kind of person does it anyway. What I think about most, though, is Marcus. Marcus, who closed a bar on a Monday night he'd meant to be home by midnight, who ended up in a parking lot at 2 a.m. next to a stranger's car, who looked when most people wouldn't look and documented when most people would decide they'd imagined it, who spent 2 hours in his apartment talking himself toward the harder choice and came down the stairs at 5:01 and grabbed my arm when I tried to close the door. Every step of that sequence required him to choose the harder thing over the easier thing, and he did it. Repeatedly, without knowing for certain that I was actually in danger, without knowing that the photograph would matter, without any guarantee that he wasn't going to knock on a neighbor's door before sunrise, and have her laugh in his face and call him paranoid. I would have laughed. I did laugh. He held on anyway. A few weeks after everything settled, I went upstairs and made him dinner. Not as a thank you, or not only, I'm not sure a dinner covers what I was actually trying to do, which was sit across a table from a person who had chosen not to look away and acknowledge it in some direct way. We ate and talked about other things mostly, the way neighbors do, and at some point he said, "I almost didn't come down, you know. I had myself half convinced it was nothing." And I said, "What made you come?" And he thought for a second and said, "I decided I'd rather look foolish in front of you than find out later I was right and hadn't said anything. I'd rather look foolish in front of you than find out later I was right and hadn't said anything." I've tried to write better than that, and I can't, because it's already the right sentence. It's the whole model, in one sentence, of how the people who save you think. Not heroism, not certainty, not special gifts. Just the willingness to accept the cost of being wrong in the small direction, the cost of looking foolish, of imposing, of being told you're paranoid. Because the cost of being wrong in the other direction is not acceptable, full stop. Most of us could be that person more often than we are. Most of us manage our discomfort down to a comfortable level and go home and tell ourselves we're not sure, we might be wrong, it's probably nothing. And most of the time it is nothing. But sometimes a man in a bar parking lot at 2 in the morning has a legal pad with a woman's name on it, and the question of whether you say something is the question of whether she gets to have the rest of her life the way she planned it. Here's what I carry from that Tuesday, and I'll say it plain because you've sat through the whole thing and you've earned the plain version. Marcus did what he did because he was a specific kind of person, someone who trusts his own discomfort enough to act on it, even when acting feels excessive. Someone who doesn't talk himself out of the thing that needs doing by listing all the reasons it might be nothing. Someone who accepts the cost of being wrong in the small direction, looking foolish, waking a neighbor, having her laugh in his face, because the cost of being wrong in the other direction is not a price he was willing to pay on someone else's behalf without trying. Most of us are not reliably that person. We manage the discomfort down to a level we can ignore. We tell ourselves we might have misread it, that it's not our place, that we don't know enough to say something. And most of the time that's true, and nothing happens. But the calculus is wildly lopsided, what it costs to say something versus what it costs to stay quiet. And I keep coming back to why we're all so reluctant to spend the cheap currency. A few seconds of feeling foolish, a neighbor who calls you paranoid, a conversation that leads nowhere. Those are the prices of being wrong in the small direction. The price of being wrong in the other direction is a name on a list in a parking lot that nobody looked at, and a Tuesday that goes the way it was always going to go without the intervention of one man who decided he'd rather look foolish. I check certain things now. Aware, in a new way, that ordinary life contains occasionally the active attention of someone who has decided you're a character in their private accounting of their losses. Aware that this attention is usually invisible until it isn't, and that the difference is usually one person in the right place who decides not to talk themselves out of saying something. Marcus is still upstairs. We've become real neighbors now, actual conversations, not just packages. He still works nights. He still comes home at hours that would alarm most people, and I find those hours reassuring in a way I didn't before. Because there is a person upstairs who looks at parking lots carefully and documents wrong-feeling things and comes down the stairs before sunrise, when what he knows outweighs what he's afraid of looking like. Not because he's fearless, because he decided that looking foolish in front of me was a cost he could absorb, and that the alternative was not. Some. A few weeks after everything settled, I went upstairs and made him dinner. We talked about other things mostly. At some point he said, I almost didn't come down, you know. I had myself half convinced it was nothing. I asked what made him come. He thought about it and said, I decided I'd rather look foolish in front of you than find out later I was right and hadn't said anything. I've tried to write better than that sentence, and I can't. It's the whole model. Not heroism, not certainty, not special gifts. Just the willingness to pay the small wrong, instead of risk the large one. Say the thing, take the photograph. Hold on when they start to close the door.
Subscribe if this one sat with you, and tell me in the comments about the person who said something to you, at some cost to themselves, that turned out to matter. Because I want to know about the people who held on when the door was closing. There are more Marcuses in the world than we let ourselves believe, and every single one of them is the reason somebody else is still here to tell their story. Go be one of them this week. Say the thing, take the photograph, knock
on the door and hold on when they start to close it, even if they laugh, even if you feel foolish, even if it turns out to be nothing. Because the one time in 100 when it turns out to be something, that's the time that stays with you. That's the Tuesday someone is still able to have. The cost of being wrong about nothing is almost nothing. The cost of being right and staying quiet is something else entirely. And I know which one Marcus would choose again. And I know which one I'd choose, and I think you do too. Your name matters. Wherever it ends up, whatever list it lands on, there is always someone who looked at a parking lot carefully enough to notice. I hope that person is in your life. If they are, tell them.